Yourself. Welcome, Bridget.
Thank you very much, Janet, and welcome everybody. It's absolutely to be here this evening and to tell you where I am geographically. I'm actually in Gloucestershire, in a small village near Cirencester. For those of you who are sort of round and about, you may know where that is. A few words of introduction about me. I did my MBA, actually it was quite a long time ago now, back in 2000 I graduated, so much longer ago than I care to remember really. And this really was quite instrumental in me deciding to change careers. Originally I worked in industry, in finance, and moved through strategic work and change management, and I've now ended up working exclusively in the field of applied positive psychology, which is all about enabling teams and enabling people to perform at their best. And as Janet said, I work in a variety of different industries and different sectors. I do a lot of work in the education sector, a lot of work for the NHS, and then also for organisations, private organisations, working with a telecoms company at the moment, and also with a very small sort of niche marketing agency which has introduced a happiness school, actually for not just for the company but also for their clients. So that's quite an interesting venture to be working on. So I now work exclusively in the field of applied positive psychology. I also lecture on the master's programme, that's the Masters in Applied Positive Psychology at the University of East London, and I've written several books about positive psychology, with a new one coming out hopefully sometime later on this spring. So that's a little bit about me. And before I kick off, Janet's mentioned about asking questions. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, and Janet will be looking out for those and saving those up to ask at the appropriate time. And then there will be some time at the end of the webinar as well, where you can ask more questions if you have them. So let's kick off then and have a look at our first slide, and hopefully some of you will be familiar with the Dilbert series of cartoons, and I particularly like this one because of course it's all about employee engagement, so I'll give you a few minutes just to read through that, and I thought you might enjoy it. It's as soon as Dilbert mentions a subject, you know that it's definitely a buzzword, it's definitely a concept which is of some importance in management and organisational life. And as we'll see a bit later on, there are many different approaches to engagement and many different definitions of engagement. And if you're leading or managing an organisation, this can be a bit of a minefield. So in this session, we're going to focus on what we know about engagement from a science perspective, from the perspective of what research can tell us. So what we're going to be covering today is, initially we're going to start out with just looking at how the employment context has changed, because this is really what is giving rise to the sort of popularity of engagement as an idea in business. We're going to look at the link between well-being and engagement. As I said at the start, focusing on applying positive psychology in organisations is really what I specialise in now, and there is a link between well-being and engagement, which we can have a look at shortly. We'll also look at some of the research into engagement, especially the factors that contribute to it and the benefits of having a highly engaged workforce. And then we'll look at some of the measurements of engagement, some of the different surveys that you might be interested in looking at. And finally, some ideas about how engagement can be increased from the perspective of positive psychology. And we're also, as Janet said, we're going to be doing a couple of polls, and here's the first one coming right up. So poll number 1, I'm very interested to find out whose responsibility you think employee engagement is. There are lots of different definitions of engagement, as we'll explore in a bit more depth in a moment. But for the purposes of this poll, let's assume that engagement is a sort of combination of things like, your discretionary effort, going beyond what's expected, going the extra mile, if you like. It might have an element of commitment in there, maybe something about passion and energy for work, positive attitude, genuinely enjoying what you do. And it is linked to driving business success. Obviously, we wouldn't be actually probably that interested in it if it weren't actually linked to the performance of the business. So assuming that these are the kinds of themes that we're talking about when we talk about employee engagement, whose responsibility do you think it is? Is it the responsibility of the individual employee? Is it the responsibility of their manager? Is it down to the HR department? Is it perhaps the board of the organisation concerned that really should take responsibility for having engaged employees? Is it actually outside of the organisation altogether? Is it actually the government that should be interested in it? Or perhaps is it something else? And if you want to tick the something else box, it'd be very helpful for you to put in some ideas and send those along as well. So we'll give you a few minutes to think about that and think about whose responsibility you think engagement is. And then as you're doing that, I'll continue on to the next slide, and then Janet will coordinate those responses, and we'll have a look at those a bit later on. So let's start then by having a look at the changing context of work and why this is contributing to a rise in engagement. Well, there are a number of different factors to take into account, and these, I'm sure, or the kind of ideas that we're talking about here will be very familiar to you, in your strategy modules and so on. And starting with the top left-hand side, social and political attitudes. When you think about why engagement is attracting so much attention at the moment and why it's becoming such a buzzword, I think the answer is partly in what's going on around us and how external influence what happens in business. So, for example, according to a recent Edelman Trust Barometer, and if you Google the Edelman Trust Barometer, you'll be able to find lots of research about trust in different industries and different organisations. According to this recent barometer, and they do this sort of annual survey with thousands of different people across many, many different countries. In the latest survey that they've done, only 18% of people trust business leaders to tell the truth, and only 19% trust business leaders to make ethical or moral decisions. And interestingly, for government leaders, it's even worse. It's actually only 13% and 14%. So, I mean, the recent economic crisis hasn't really helped. And in fact, industries like banking, like financial services, like the media, those kind of industries are languishing at the bottom of the ratings in terms of which professions are most trusted. And this kind of thing means that business leaders really do have to think differently about employment and about how their organisations operate. If they want to ensure that they've got staff who are committed, sort of loyal, and who are going to sort of go the extra mile when they need them to, they really do have to think differently about how their businesses operate. So that's just one small example, and there will be many other sort of external influences that affect engagement. Another thing,
Bridget,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. The results of the poll are in. I'm not sure if you can all see that. You should be able to see the results now.
I see them.
Yeah, I've just ticked the share results, so you should be able to see them now. I'll read it out to you. 56% have said it's the responsibility of the employee. 63% say manager.
Sorry, what was the individual? 53, did you say, for the individual?
56 for the employee.
Yes.
63 for the manager. 22% think HR.
Yeah.
34% think the board.
Yeah.
3% think the government.
Yep.
And 3% think other, and we've just had a couple of no answers. So,
did we have any with the others? Did we have any examples of what people were thinking of, or
we had one person come through who said education is key to this as well. So, education plays a role as well. So, yeah,
it does. That's interesting. So we've got overwhelming number of people voting for the responsibility for the manager and the individual employee, and
yes,
fewer people voting for the board of the organisation, which is quite interesting, and even fewer the HR department, which is another interesting point. And only 3% saying it's the responsibility of the government. We're going to sort of talk a bit more about those details in a moment, so I'll come back to that. I'll just put that to one side. Thanks, Janet, for that, and I'll come back to that. Let's just continue having a look at what's driving the sort of changing context for engagement. We were talking about the factors that drive success, and there are obviously the business landscape is continually changing. We've had a shift from manufacturing to service and knowledge economies. We've had lots of new initiatives being introduced and new ways of working. Restructuring and outsourcing and all those kinds of things. And any new initiative, even if it's one to do with increasing engagement, is quite likely to be a factor that meets with some cynicism in an organisation. But basically, employers are always looking for new ways of gaining a competitive advantage or sustaining what they've got. And it could be that if you take any two organisations of sort of similar size and similar ways of operating, that actually what really drives the difference in their success is how engaged their employees are. So this is another reason why employers are taking engagement as quite a serious business. The other thing is that what customers want from the business is changing, and how they're judging companies is changing. With there being such a rise of social media and people being able to share what they think about companies very freely, and sharing opinions of products and ways of working and so on, organisations can't get away with, for example, delivering bad service. And people might remember that case that was in the news late last year of somebody who'd complained on Twitter. They'd paid for an advert on Twitter because they were so dissatisfied with the service they got from British Airways, as it happens. So companies do have to be much more visible about what because of social media, they have to be much more visible about what they're doing. And consumers expect a lot more from companies as well. So they can choose whether to be customers of banks which have ethical investment policies, or whether they have similar values to them, they share similar values and so on. So employers are constantly being forced to think differently about how they operate and how they're seen to operate. And that's another factor. And lastly, what employees want themselves, we've got to take that into account. And when we go back to the Eagleman Trust Barometer, it has been said that there's almost a crisis of leadership, because employees actually trust other employees who have technical expertise more than they trust their top executives, which is quite interesting. So employees would prefer to trust somebody else on a peer group who has technical expertise rather than trust somebody who's at the top of their organisation. And that whole thing about the psychological contract, which you may have come across, has changed how employees react or interact with their company. So they're no longer got a job for life, but what employees are now saying is that they'll stay with a company so long as they get what they need and what they want from the job, and as long as they don't find something better. And certainly for the younger generation of employees, they do have very different expectations of what work will deliver. They want something that's not just a good salary and an interesting job to do, but they want something that has more meaning and something that is aligned with their values. So all of this means that actually organisations have to think very differently about how to get the best performance from their employees. and that's really where thinking about employee engagement comes in. So if we go back to the results of that poll and have a look at sort of what is happening, particularly in the UK, is that actually, from the UK employees' perspective, only around 30%, from a very recent study, around 30% of UK employees are actively engaged at work. And in fact, in the States, the survey data from the States is even lower. So they reckon that only about 20% of employees are engaged, actively engaged at work. And I don't know about you, but I think that's quite horrifying, really. If you were to think about, I don't know, your computers at work, this is an example that's sometimes used. You wouldn't countenance a situation where only a third of your computers were working, or even fewer. You'd certainly want to do something about it. So it's interesting that we're in a situation where actually only around a third of employees are actually actively engaged in what they do. And then this is linked to productivity, and data from the Office for National Statistics suggests that the UK productivity, as measured by output per worker, is about 20% lower than the rest of the G7 countries, and we do lag behind other large economies in terms of our engagement. So it's quite a complex picture, but we do have lower engagement, we do have lower productivity than many of our sort of competitors, and that's really something that has come to the attention of leaders of large organisations. When the Corporate Leadership Board did a survey back in 2011, 70% of business leaders said that they put engagement as a number one factor for success, critical for success of the business. So certainly business leaders are taking it quite seriously. And going back to the survey, we had the 3% of people who said that the government had some responsibility for engagement. It's interesting that, again, in the UK, there has been a report commissioned very recently on engagement, something called the MacLeod report, which, again, you can Google and you can find the full report with all the details in it. And this is very well worth reading. You'll find a lot of useful information there, case studies, surveys, and so on. And even if your company isn't UK based, there is some useful information in there. So those people who thought that the government should have some responsibility for engagement, I think you'd be right in suggesting that, because of course, as we've just seen, it is actually linked to overall productivity. And clearly the government, particularly at the moment, is very concerned about how we compete against other countries. But this particular review that they commissioned has led to an organisation being set up called Engage for Success, and I put the URL there. And Engage for Success is there to promote the importance of engagement for organisations and to support business leaders and managers to drive productivity and performance through increasing engagement. And it provides lots of information, some of which is academic, some of which is practitioner-led, as well as lots of case studies and so on, which will help you develop your own business case if it's something that you feel your own organisation needs to focus on. You'll get a lot of information there that you can include. And I want now to just look, I talked earlier about well-being, and we've had a large number of people in the poll say that the individual employee is responsible for engagement. And in a way, you would also be right, because we know from the science, from positive psychology, that well-being, engagement and performance are all linked. So engagement, people who have higher well-being, what we call psychological well-being, or PWB as it's shown on this slide, people who have higher psychological well-being also have higher levels of engagement. They enjoy their work more, they're more productive, more resilient, they persist longer when faced with challenges, they take fewer days off on sick leave, they respond better to critical feedback, they get on better with their peer group, with their colleagues, and they tend to be more flexible and creative. So there are lots of really good reasons why we should think about well-being and engagement from an organisational perspective, because they, all of these factors are, crucial for the success of a company. So the key thing here is that psychological well-being and engagement are connected. And remember that engagement, it's not about, how many hours you spend in the office and whether you're, you're still at work while you're on holiday. It's not that kind of thing that we're interested in. It's really whether you enjoy your work and whether you are genuinely enthusiastic and energetic about it. Whether on a Monday morning you actually look forward to going to work and to working with your colleagues, and whether your work is meaningful. So those are the factors around engagement that we're talking about, and not just the amount of time you spend at your desk and how many hours you put in. So if you like, the suggestion from positive psychology is that we should be doing more to focus on increasing people's psychological well-being, as well as thinking about how to create the right conditions for employee engagement. So if you like, those of you who said it's also the individual manager or the employer or the HR department who have responsibility for engagement, that's also right, because these are the people who have to ensure that the conditions at work are right, or the culture is right, to allow engagement to flourish. But bearing in mind that the individual person, the individual employee, is also, or has some responsibility for their engagement. Let's have a quick look at what psychological well-being is, because this is relevant to how we increase engagement, which we'll see in a moment. The research from psychology gives us a formula, if you like, for well-being, and that is that well-being is made up of three things. Firstly, your predisposition to be happy, and that's, in other words, your genetic background, your upbringing, and so on, those kinds of things. Your circumstances, the kind of job you do, where you live, that sort of thing, and then also the activities that are under your voluntary control. Now, what's interesting and important about this formula is that the three factors contribute different amounts to well-being. So your genetic background and upbringing contributes 50%, but there's not much you can do about your genes, well, certainly not at the moment. Your circumstances only contribute about 10%, but interestingly, that's what most people focus on when they're thinking about how to change their well-being. They focus on changing their job or changing where they live, buying a new house, and so on. But what we know from the science is actually that people should be focusing on other things, the activities that are under your control at the moment, the things that you do every day, in other words, and they contribute 40%. And this is relevant when we look at engagement in a moment. And what we also know from positive psychology is that there are 5 different pathways to well-being. In short, 5 different types of well-being. You can achieve it through sheer positive emotion, through enjoying yourself and having fun. That's one part of it. Through experiencing flow and being challenged in what you do, using your strengths. That's the second part. Building high-quality connections with other people and building good quality relationships with your colleagues and so on. That's the third part. Finding meaning and purpose in what you do. And lastly, achievement, not just in a traditional sense of qualifications and so on, but building your competence and feeling that you're moving on and that you're developing as a person. And these are relevant factors, as we'll see in a moment. But just to think about engagement, what it is, if you Google employee engagement, you'll be faced with something a bit like this. A whole host of different models, different approaches, different definitions. And how on earth do you decipher all of this? I think it's quite a difficult thing to do. The definitions of employee engagement do overlap, and this can be quite confusing, particularly if you want to benchmark your organisation against another one. So you do have to think carefully about that, because it's not necessarily easy to compare one organisation to another. assuming that people are actually measuring engagement at all, which is another factor which we'll come on to in a moment. So when we look at the definitions then of what engagement is, there are many different definitions, and that's partly because it's a relatively new field of research in psychology. It's been around for about 10 years or so, so there's plenty of room really for more good quality research and for the definitions to be narrowed down. But I draw your attention to the bottom two, the last but one, a positive, fulfilling, work-related state of mind that's characterised by vigour, dedication and absorption, and the last one, the extent to which employees thrive at work, are committed to their employer and are motivated to do their best for the benefit of themselves and their organisation. And the reason for looking at those two is because of the link with psychological well-being, positive states of mind and thriving. And these are especially useful for us as practitioners, as coaches, as business leaders, because there is a huge amount of evidence now that you increase psychological well-being, and if you can increase well-being, you can increase engagement as well. We've got another poll coming up here, second poll. Do you have a definition of employee engagement in your organisation? Yes, no, or not sure. And if you do have a definition, is it one that you've created specifically for your organisation, so something that's very tailor-made, or is it a definition that you've adopted from another source? So if you want to have a go at that poll, and then Janet will come in with the results in just a moment.
Bridget, before you move on to the next slide, we've actually got a couple of questions, so I'll ask them as we go along. Yeah. Christian asked from early on in the your presentation, you were talking about a survey and you mentioned there were lots of results coming up in Google, and he asked, was that about trust in companies? But I'm guessing that it might be is it McLeod report you were talking about?
There's the McLeod report. You can
The
McLeod. Yes, you can certainly find that on Google. If you look at the Engage for Success website as well, you will find, I think, a link to the McLeod report there. The Edelman Trust Barometer, I suppose we could send a link to that. Could we, Janet? Is that something we could do? Or perhaps we could send a link to all of these things.
I was going to say I can send a link out later on when I send everybody the recording. So yes, I can certainly do that later on.
We can put the links in, and then it'll make it easy for people to find the things that we're referring to. Because the Edelman Trust Barometer, it's a big website with a lot of data in, going back over a substantial period of time and looking at lots of different industries, and you can look at the data in a number of different ways. But very useful if you're interested in thinking about trying to measure the amount of trust in an organisation and how to compare one industry against another, or within industries and so on. So very useful.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Christian says thank you. We've got one more question from Gerard. Can you give some examples of gauging employee satisfaction and their contribution rating to the organisation strategic outlook? They can be satisfied at work without contributing to their full potential. I think that ties in with your last slide, actually, Bridget.
Shall I go back? Let me go back. This one? Is that the one you were talking of, Janet?
Yes, I mean, I don't know how if that ties in with Gerald's question.
I think the satisfaction is it's one of those concepts which can be defined in so many different ways. And I think it's the case that you can be satisfied with your work without actually making a contribution. When we look a bit later at some of the measurements of engagement, you'll be able to see the types of questions that sort of academic researchers are looking at when they're trying to measure engagement, because some of them are thinking about engagement in very specific ways. So if I could leave that question until we get to a little bit later on, and hopefully what we talk about a bit later will sort of highlight or sort of elaborate on that point. Would that be okay?
Lovely. Thank you very much, Bridget. And the poll results are now in. And we have, do you have a definition? Yes, there are 23%.
It's okay,
no,
yeah.
37%. Not sure, 20%, and no answer, 20%.
Yeah.
If yes, a definition created specifically for your organisation, and that's 14%.
Yeah.
A definition adopted from another source, and that's 6%. Not sure, 9%, and no answer, 74%.
Yeah. It would be, if it'd be quite, I don't know whether we can share people's definitions of engagement. It certainly would be interesting to have a look at some of those. On the Engaged Success website, I really do think that's a very good one for getting lots of background information into how different organisations are measuring it. They have their own definition. It's got 4 factors, which to refer to a bit later on. But interestingly, because of the fact that there are so many, what you want to be able to do, well, what some organisations want to be able to do is benchmark themselves against others. You do need to sort of obviously pick a definition which is sort of common, in common usage. And some of the measurements we're going to look at a bit later, well, one of them in particular is in very common usage across lots of different organisations. So that might be interesting for people to have a look at. But those results suggest actually that I don't know that the majority of people don't have a definition, but I suppose that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not focusing on increasing engagement in some way. We've got another poll coming up a bit later, which asks about the kinds of things that people are doing, and so maybe we can kind of tie the 2 polls together and have a look at the kinds of things that people are actually doing, those who are measuring and monitoring engagement. So we can come back to the results a bit later on. So I just want to move on and have a look at some of the benefits of investing in engagement. And there are, again, there's lots of different studies, lots of research on this. I would actually sort of just make one sort of caveat, and that is a lot of the studies that you see or surveys that you see being quoted are no more than that. They're just surveys. They're not sort of academic research. So you do have to bear in mind, who is running the survey and for what reasons are they running it, because often they obviously have a vested interest. But the things that I've got here on this particular slide mostly come from the Gallup organisation, which is one of the biggest organisations in the world, really, that has runs a lot of studies into engagement and using strengths in lots of different business contexts. And what they have discovered is that people who where there is high engagement, there is also high employee retention. There is also a link between engagement and employee performance. There's a link with customer satisfaction and actually a link with profit as well. Interesting, in terms of the profit one, they found in their research that business units who are in the top quartile on engagement have on average between 1% and 4% higher profitability than businesses in the bottom quartile on engagement. So it's a pretty significant effect. And clearly there's a link between physical and mental health as well. If I would have a look at, so if you look at the Gallup organisation website again, it's one which is full of interesting studies and useful pieces of information about employee engagement. So perhaps that's another link that we can send people at the end. So really, just summing up this slide, there's a lot of research now coming out from various psychologists and other academics that there is a link between people being engaged at work and business success factors. So that's worth bearing in mind, again, if you're putting together some kind of business case. And the other thing to remember is something which psychologists call emotional contagion, and that is that how engaged you are as a leader or as a manager will impact how engaged other people are around you, and vice versa. And as we said, it's not about the time you spend at your desk. It's really about how enthusiastic and how much you genuinely enjoy your job, and how much energy you have for your work, rather than about the sort of the time you put into it. And that's actually quite difficult to fake. You know, genuine enthusiasm for your work is actually something that you can't easily fake, I don't think. So I want to come back now to that idea of the equation. You remember earlier on we looked at the equation for well-being, that it was made up of those 3 factors. Martin Stairs and Martin Gulpin, who are 2 British psychologists, have suggested that we can use a very similar equation if we want to understand engagement at work. So again, 3 factors. It's made up of your predisposition to be engaged at work, and that contributes 50% to how engaged or disengaged you are. The work conditions themselves contribute 10%, and the activities that you do every day, the way you think about work, and so on, that contributes 40%. So there are lots of things that we can do as individuals, 40%. Contributing to our engagement. There are lots of things we can do as individuals to increase our own level of engagement. And if we just have a quick look at what those 3 factors are in more depth, predisposition, the thing that contributes to 50%, this is really your, if you like, your personality, or some of your personality factors. And it seems to be the case that some people are more predisposed to be engaged at work, in the way that some people, for example, are more resilient than others. But it's a relatively new, as I said, relatively new field of scientific inquiry, so we've got some way to go. But what we do know is that people who are emotionally stable, they are high on the big 5 personality factors of extroversion and conscientiousness, and they have high emotional intelligence, they are more likely to be engaged at work. And interestingly, if you work with an ability model of emotional intelligence, you can actually increase your level of emotional intelligence, and you can certainly work on your well-being and your optimism and self-esteem, for example. Those are things that you can change through deliberate practice and through deliberate interventions. So that's the kind of things that make up predisposition. The things that contribute in terms of work conditions are things like whether or not you have autonomy and control over the job you do, whether you get a lot of support and coaching to do a good job and to improve your performance, whether you get good quality feedback on your performance, whether there's a lot of variety in the jobs that you do, whether you feel you've got opportunities to develop as a person, and certainly the fit of your values with the organisational values. All of these kind of conditions, if you like, around work, around your job, contribute to engagement, but they don't contribute in the way that you might think. So I don't know whether you can remember from some of your studies the idea of Hertzberg's hygiene factors and motivator factors. So there are some things which contribute to how satisfied you are at work, and some things which don't contribute at all. And what Martin Stairs and Martin Gulpin are suggesting is that these work conditions work in the same way. In other words, they don't make you actively engaged, but if you don't have them, if they're not present in the work that you do, then you're likely to be disengaged. So they don't provide active engagement, but if they're not there, they will mean that you're disengaged. So if you like, they're essential. They're like a benchmark or a baseline, if you like. So you have to have them, but having more of them won't actually mean that you increase engagement at all. So that's the work conditions part of it. And then we have the big 40%, you know, those things which you do, the things that are under your voluntary control. These are the things which psychologists are suggesting we focus on to increase engagement. So, for example, enjoying your job, making sure that there are plenty of opportunities to experience positive emotions at work, that you have the right level of challenge, that you're able to use your strengths at work, building good quality relationships with other people, making sure you find a sense of meaning and purpose in what you do, and linking your own personal meaning to the meaning of the organisation, the purpose of the organisation, and lastly, being able to get a sense of achievement. So these are the things that, like Bridget is suggesting, that we start focusing on, and we're thinking of changing or increasing employee engagement. And our last poll number 3, what we're interested in now is finding out from you whether your organisation is focusing on increasing employee engagement, and if they are, what kind of things are they doing? So, for example, do they have a designated manager who's responsible for engagement? Is there a regular survey going on at work to measure it or to monitor it? Does it form part of manager training? Do you have coaches or mentors who focus on engagement, perhaps with individual employees? Is there a focus on psychological well-being at work? Maybe all of these things are happening, or maybe there's something else. So if you could just spend a moment or two having a look at that poll, and then hopefully we can put the results.
Bridget, I was going to say, but while everybody's doing the poll, we have got a couple of questions come in, if I can put them to you. Shazia has asked if a loss of well-being of an individual can impact on employee engagement. There could be times when personal or work circumstances impact on this. Do you think organisations and managers have the relevant know-how to recognise and resolve this?
That's an interesting question. I would say yes, they are linked. Neither well-being or engagement are, if you like, stable factors in the sense that they go up and down. They change. It depends what's going on at work, and certainly what's going on in your personal life. So whilst people might be, predisposed to have a certain range for their well-being and engagement, there might be times when they're, at the top of that range, and there might be other times when they're at the bottom of that range. So it's not going to be completely unchangeable throughout your career or your experience in whatever job that you're doing. I'm not sure that all employers have the necessary sort of knowledge and skill to work on psychological well-being, but interestingly there are lots of new resources and new ways of working coming out, particularly things like strengths. Strengths is an area of interest for lots of big organisations now, and that is one element of the sort of the wheel of psychological well-being, and it's one I think that lots of I think increasingly organisations are going to be interested in looking at. So it's not the same thing as competencies, but it's something that is relatively easily measured, and it can form the basis of a very good, for example, coaching series of coaching sessions. So I think there are lots of things that employees can do. Just need to have the sort of the knowledge and the awareness, really, that they can be doing things in that area. Does that make sense?
Lovely, thank you. Yes, and Mark has said that his organisation's definition of EEI is distributed to everyone with 8 or more responses from a quarterly survey. The Employee Engagement Index is a combination of 6 questions. Working at X makes me want to do the best work I can. 2, I'm proud of working at X. 3, I have the authority I need to make decisions. 4, I am able to use my skills and abilities. 5, I feel like my ideas and opinions count. 6, I believe that when change happens, it happens for the right business reasons. Thank you for that, Mark. It sounds like your organisation is quite switched on.
That's quite an interesting range of questions, and some of those certainly would touch on, when we look a bit in a moment at some of the measurements of engagement. Some of those questions I think are very close to the ones that psychologists are sort of recommending that people ask. yeah, I particularly like the ones about whether you feel proud of the organisation you work for anything that sort of touches on positive emotion, and often surveys sort of shy away from that kind of thing. I think because, going back to the previous question, that sometimes employers don't really know what to do to boost positive levels of positive emotion. So it's very interesting that Mark's survey does include that. So let's come back to this in just a moment once we've had a look at some of the measurements. Because as we said, there are lots of different definitions, and sometimes what consultants say they're measuring, they say they're measuring engagement isn't actually engagement at all. The survey that I referred to earlier is called the Gallup Q12, and I think some of these questions are going to be similar to the ones that you've just read out, Janet. So you've got 12 very simple questions here, and these have been asked of millions of people now, right across numerous countries across the world, and has become quite an important survey, I think, because it's such a simple one. And people have been using versions of it, because obviously this is trademarked, but people have been sort of asking similar questions along similar lines. And so I think it's quite an important survey, and one which people might want to, again, to look at on the Gallup website and to see what kind of results Gallup is gathering from different companies. And I do remember from some of the research I read that question 10, I have a best friend at work, is actually quite an important one in terms of how engaged people feel. So the quality of the relationships they have, and whether they have somebody at work that they can rely on, who's going to be there for them, give them the support they need, who's not going to judge them, etc. All of those things are important factors to take into account. The other survey I was going to mention is this one, the Utrecht Work Engagement Survey, which was designed by Shai Faley and colleagues at the University of Utrecht. And this is a very interesting survey. It measures three different factors. It measures vigour, as shown by the questions marked with a V. It measures absorption at work, how absorbed and engaged you get in your work, and dedication, how committed you are. And again, you've got quite a number of questions here which are talking about positive emotion. Again, you've got the one about I feel proud of the work that I do. My job inspires me, I feel enthusiastic. So a lot of questions there about how positive you feel about the job that you're doing. So it's not about the hours that you work, it's about how you feel about the job that you do.
The poll results are in now, Bridget, if you want me to run through them.
Mm.
Yeah. Does your organisation focus on increasing employee engagement?
Yep.
50% said yes.
Great.
24% said no.
Yeah.
12% said not sure, and 15% no answer.
Yep.
If yes, how?
Mm-hmm.
6% said designated HR manager who is responsible for EE. 38% said regular survey to measure and monitor EE, and I guess Mark is one of those ones. EE forms part of manager training. That is actually 9%. Mm-hmm. Coaches and mentoring is 15%. Focus on the psychological well-being, that's 12%. All of the above, no percent, and other 6%. And there were 44 no answers, so there you go.
That's encouraging that you've got 50% of people actually focusing in some way on engagement, on increasing engagement. And that kind of split there of results is quite interesting as well. With 38% actually doing some kind of survey, which is great, because obviously you do need to be able to measure stuff. And curious actually in terms of doing stuff, like having somebody who's responsible for it, or being part of manager training, there's a lower percentage of people that do that. So it's great that it's being measured, but clearly you want to move from measurement to actually doing something active in order, if assuming that the engagement can be increased, assuming it's not already as good as it possibly could be, finding ways to do something different to actually boost well-being. And that's really where, to boost engagement, and that's really where we come on to the last but one, I think, slide. Because the positive psychology approach to improving engagement is actually you focus on the 40% of enhancing your psychological well-being, because the two things are so closely linked together, as one of the people asked in a question earlier on. So if you're thinking about how to boost engagement at work, what psychologists are saying is focus on increasing their well-being. So things like getting people to identify and play to their strengths is a key part of it. Allowing people to find flow at work, building on positivity, making sure people actually enjoy the work they do, have some fun at work. It's not all hard slog all the time. Things like practicing mindfulness, fantastic for measuring, for mitigating stress and for developing resilience. Things like building optimism and, as I touched on earlier, meaning, finding meaning between what you do and the kind of goals that you have and the organisation's purpose. These are all sort of crucial things in terms of building well-being. And we know that these things can be changed. So there's lots of evidence in psychology now that these things can change if you have deliberate interventions to focus on them. And so what psychologists are saying is this is what you need to be focusing on when you're thinking about engagement. So you don't have to have a kind of wishy-washy definition. You can be quite specific about the things that you're going to focus on and the things that you're going to do, the actions that you're going to take. And the last slide, just to sum up, so we've got a few minutes left for any questions at the end.
We have got a couple.
Yes. So summing up, engagement is a critical factor in terms of a company's success. It's linked to profitability, productivity, linked to turnover and retention, and clearly those are critical things in an organisation. There is a link between well-being, engagement and performance. We know that from research. We know that leaders and managers play a crucial role. Yes, the individual employee has to take responsibility for their own well-being and a certain sense of responsibility for the engagement at work, but clearly leaders and managers have to make sure the context of work and the culture at work is the right culture in order for engagement and well-being to thrive. And lastly, research suggests that if you focus on well-being, you're going to have a greater impact. So that's it really for tonight. Janet, would you like to throw some more?
Yes, Chris actually asked a question, but he thinks it's been answered, but I'll read it out to you anyway. Many of the topics discussed have a similar flavour to the HSE stress risk assessment. Do you feel that there is a link between the lack of engagement results and an increased risk of stress at work?
Now that's interesting because from a sort of academic perspective, engagement and disengagement are two quite different things, and you can measure them in different ways. So you can, if you like, you can get rid of stress, and yes, it would affect the level of disengagement, but it's unlikely to boost engagement. Do you see what I mean? Because they're two separate things. You need to be doing different things if you want to boost engagement. So yes, of course you need to deal with stress. Of course you do. That's essential. But you also can think of what else could I do to boost engagement. So you need to almost be doing both in tandem.
Right, thank you, Bridget. Shazia has asked, do you feel that the culture of organisations will impact on how they could integrate employee engagement? And do you feel that adopting performance appraisals to ask employees directly what they feel about their well-being could help in improving an individual's performance?
I certainly think the culture makes a difference. Inevitably, there'll be some organisations that seem to be perfectly profitable and operating perfectly well without any sort of direct focus on engagement, and there'll be others for whom engagement, is something that could make a significant difference to their success. So I think the culture does matter very much, and I don't think it's necessarily right for all organisations. I think that well-being is a crucial part of getting the best out of people at work, and the whole question of how performance appraisals are carried out is a very interesting one. In my experience, they're inevitably focused on what people don't do well and trying to make them do those things better. Clearly, there's a sort of baseline at which people have to operate, of course, but it makes much more sense. What we know from psychology research, it makes much more sense to get people to focus on the things they do well and do those even better. So a bit like when you have Belb and team roles, you know, and you have people doing different things, it's make sure the people you've got are doing the things that they're good at doing, and not get them doing things that really they're only ever going to do at a mediocre level. So focus on the strengths that people have and try and get them to play to their strengths, and that's all part of well-being.
Thank you, Bridget. Jonathan has asked if it would be possible to provide the full references to the sources that have been referenced so that he could read more about the research performed in the area. Is that going to be a little bit too difficult, or can we do that for Jonathan? I'm
sure I can find most of them, yes. Yeah, so that should be fun.
You.
Yeah, it might take me a few days, but I'm sure I can.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Right, well, I think we're coming to the end of the evening now. Bridget, if I could ask you to just pop it onto the next slide for me so that I can talk about our next webinar. Thank you all for joining us. As you can see, the next webinar is on the 9th of April, questioning and listening skills. Mind you, I think you've all got those because you've all been asking some brilliant questions. So, but please do join us, and we look forward to seeing you then. So good night, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much, Janet. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.